My name is Scarlett. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe with words like steady, reliable, and sometimes, if they're being honest, harmless. I live in Chicago. I've spent the last 8 years working in corporate operations for a mid-sized consulting firm. My job title sounds unremarkable. My presence, even more so. I don't dominate meetings. I don't interrupt. I don't perform intelligence for applause. I listen, I document, I anticipate. Most people mistake that for a lack of ambition. I've learned that when you are calm, organized, and emotionally contained, people project onto you. They assume you are content with less. They assume you don't see what's happening. They assume you won't react. This is the story of the day I realized they were recruiting my successor behind a glass wall I could see through. I wish I could say it was dramatic, that someone stormed into my office, that there were whispers and pointed fingers, but the truth is quieter than that. My replacement was sitting in the interview room while I was still employed. There's something uniquely clarifying about watching someone discuss your job description through transparent glass. You don't panic. You don't cry. You just understand. What I'm going to tell you isn't a revenge story. No screaming matches, no illegal recordings, no dramatic exits with cardboard boxes and applause. That kind of narrative might feel satisfying, but it wouldn't be honest. This is about something slower. It's about the small cuts that come before the final wound, the subtle shifts in tone, the meetings you're no longer invited to, the language that changes around you, the way people start explaining their own expertise back to you. It's about silence, not as submission, but as strategy. And it's about what happens when the person everyone underestimates decides not to protest, but to reposition. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through how I was perceived, how I almost convinced myself that perception was acceptable, and the exact moment I chose not to fight, but to move differently. If you've ever felt quietly sidelined, if you've ever sensed something changing before anyone said it out loud, if you've ever wondered whether staying calm makes you weak or powerful, then this story might feel familiar. Let me ask you something gently before we begin. Have you ever realized you were being replaced before anyone had the courage to tell you? Before the glass wall? Before the interview room? Before I understood the shape of what was happening? I was the dependable one. That's what they called me when I wasn't in the room. If a client escalated an issue, it came to me. If a deadline slipped, I stayed late. If two departments misunderstood each other, I translated. But I was rarely introduced as the strategist behind the systems. I was introduced as support. Scarlett will help with that. It's a subtle word, help. Helpful people are not threatening. Helpful people are not promoted quickly. Helpful people are expected to be grateful. In meetings, I sat slightly back from the center of the table. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I preferred perspective. I watched who interrupted whom. I watched who took credit. I watched whose ideas were repeated louder and rebranded. Sometimes my own sentences came back to me wearing someone else's voice. I would nod, not because I didn't notice, but because I was collecting patterns. They perceived me as calm to the point of passivity. Even my direct supervisor, Mark, once laughed lightly during a leadership workshop and said, "Scarlett doesn't get rattled. I don't think I've ever seen her emotional." It was meant as a compliment, but underneath it was an assumption. She won't push back. The irony was that I felt everything. I simply didn't externalize it for display. I processed before reacting. And in a culture addicted to visible ambition, quiet processing looks like compliance. When new hires joined, I trained them. When software shifted, I rebuilt the workflows. When executive directives changed direction mid-quarter, I absorbed the operational shock so the rest of the team wouldn't feel it. I was the insulation, and insulation is invisible until it's removed. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't feel cruel at first. It feels efficient. You become the person people rely on without questioning your authority. You're looped into problems, but not into decisions. You're asked for solutions, but not for vision. I told myself that stability was power. I told myself that recognition would come eventually. I told myself that leadership notices consistency. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. Meetings that used to include me moved to calendar slots I wasn't invited to. Strategic planning documents circulated after key decisions were already finalized. My updates were shortened, summarized by someone else. Scarlett will operationalize it. Operationalize, translate, execute, never define. When people underestimate you, they speak more freely around you. They let their guard down. They assume you won't interpret subtext. What they didn't realize was that invisibility creates proximity to truth. I heard the jokes. I saw the reshuffling of responsibilities. I noticed when my access permissions changed on shared folders. None of it was overt. None of it was dramatic. Just a slow repositioning. And still, I didn't confront anyone. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to be certain. There's a difference between paranoia and pattern recognition. And I have always trusted my patterns. At that time, though, I was still operating under one assumption, that my value was too embedded to be quietly replaced. I hadn't yet seen the glass wall. The first cut didn't draw blood. That's the thing about subtle disrespect. It arrives dressed as logistics. It was a Tuesday morning, late spring, the kind of morning where the office light feels too white and everyone is moving slightly faster than usual because Q2 projections were due. I walked into the weekly operations sink and noticed something small. My chair had been moved, not removed, just shifted slightly off the table's natural curve. A new chair sat closer to Mark, occupied by Daniel, one of the newer project leads I had trained less than a year earlier. I didn't react. I adjusted my notebook, sat down, and opened to a fresh page. Halfway through the meeting, Mark began outlining a new restructuring initiative, a streamlining of leadership touchpoints. His words, not mine. He looked at Daniel when discussing process redesign. Not at me. Daniel spoke with confidence. He used language I recognized immediately, phrases I had written in a proposal draft months earlier. He framed inefficiencies I had privately flagged. He suggested workflow adjustments that were, quite literally, built on systems I created. No one corrected the origin. No one asked for clarification, and I didn't interrupt. Instead, I listened carefully to what wasn't said. Mark concluded with, Daniel will start shadowing cross-departmental operations to get a broader view. Shadowing. That had been my lane for years. After the meeting, Daniel approached me casually. Hey, Scarlett, I might pick your brain later about how you handle vendor escalation documentation, just to make sure I'm aligned. Aligned. I smiled politely. Of course, because on the surface, nothing inappropriate had happened. No one demoted me. No one criticized my performance. No one excluded me explicitly. It was just a shift in gravity. Later that afternoon, I opened the shared drive and noticed Daniel had been granted editing access to the master operations architecture file. That file had always required my approval. Again, no announcement, no transition discussion, just expanded permissions. That was the first moment something in my chest tightened. Not anger, not panic, recognition. I minimized the window and leaned back in my chair, staring at the glass wall across the office floor. People moved inside conference rooms, their gestures animated, their laughter visible but inaudible. I thought about speaking to Mark. I even drafted an email in my head. Just wanted clarity on role adjustments. But clarity can sometimes accelerate what you're not ready to confirm. So I waited. That evening, as I packed my black leather notebook into my bag, I flipped back through earlier entries, process diagrams, risk assessments, strategic suggestions I had submitted and never received feedback on. The patterns were aligning. Still, I told myself it was mentorship, succession planning, growth for the team. Good leaders delegate, and I had always positioned myself as reasonable. But here's what stayed with me. No one asked how I felt about it. The decision flowed around me, not through me. And that is how small cuts work. They don't remove your title. They remove your center of gravity. Everyone else left that Tuesday believing it had been a productive meeting. I left knowing something had moved, and not in my favor. I just didn't know how far it would go. After the first cut, nothing exploded. That would have been easier. Instead, everything continued as if nothing had changed, which is how normalization begins. Daniel started attending more cross-functional meetings. At first, I was still included, then I was optional. Then I received summaries. Looping you in for visibility, the emails would say. Visibility, a polite word for distance. I told myself this was evolution. Organizations shift, roles expand. Senior leaders test new structures. I had been in corporate operations long enough to know that influence isn't always loud. But influence also isn't erased quietly unless someone allows it. And I allowed it. The second time I noticed it publicly was during a client escalation call. Normally, I would lead those conversations, calmly, precisely, mapping next steps while diffusing tension. That day, Mark opened the call by saying, Daniel will walk us through the remediation plan. Daniel. He stumbled through the first few minutes. Not terribly, just inexperienced. I watched the client's face tighten slightly on the screen. I recognized the early signs of lost confidence. My instinct was to step in. I didn't. I let him finish. And when the client asked a technical question Daniel couldn't answer, he glanced at me. Scarlett, do you want to add anything? Add anything. As if I were supplementing, not architecting. I responded clearly, efficiently, filling the gaps without exposing him. The call stabilized. The client thanked Daniel for the leadership. Not maliciously, just inaccurately. Afterward, Daniel stopped by my desk. Appreciate you backing me up, I said. Backing me up. I smiled again. We're a team. That phrase became my shield. We're a team. It allowed me to rationalize the shifting dynamics. It made the erosion feel collaborative rather than intentional. But the pattern continued. My calendar invitations grew thinner. Strategic discussions happened in smaller groups. My name remained on org charts, but my voice carried less weight in rooms that used to rely on it. And the most dangerous part? No one was being cruel. There were no villains. No whispered campaigns against me, just incremental redirection of authority. That's how disrespect embeds itself into culture, through repetition without objection. I began noticing how often I prefaced statements with disclaimers. Just a thought, maybe we could consider, I might be wrong, but I had never needed those softeners before. Somewhere along the way, I adjusted my tone to accommodate the room's new center of gravity. Daniel became more confident. Mark praised his fresh perspective. Leadership highlighted his strategic thinking. I had trained that thinking. But credit, once rerouted, rarely flows back upstream. At night, I would replay conversations in my head. Not obsessively, just analytically. Was I imagining the shift? Was I being territorial? Was this simply succession planning and I was reacting emotionally? I pride myself on objectivity. So I gathered data. I tracked how many meetings I was removed from. I documented when decisions were made without my input. I noted how often my recommendations were echoed later by someone else and received more enthusiasm. The list grew. Still, I remained outwardly composed. Because confronting something too early can brand you as insecure, and I refused to be labeled threatened, so I normalized it. I told myself leadership is about letting go. I told myself visibility isn't the same as value. I told myself patience would correct the imbalance. But patience without boundaries doesn't command respect. It invites replacement. I didn't yet know how literal that would become. Not until the day I looked up from my desk and saw through the glass. There's a moment when you realize the room has decided who you are, not maliciously, not through a vote, just through repetition. By early summer, my role had crystallized into something unspoken but firmly understood. I was the stabilizer, the institutional memory, the one who would fix things quietly after bold decisions were made by others. In meetings, I noticed a new rhythm. Daniel would present, Mark would endorse, leadership would nod, and then, inevitably, someone would turn to me and say, Scarlett, can you make sure that's implemented smoothly? Not, what do you think? Not, is this viable? Not, do you see risks we're missing? Just implementation, execution without authorship. I became the safety net beneath strategic acrobatics. And safety nets, by design, are not the performers. One afternoon, HR sent an email about an internal leadership development program. It was selective, invitation only, designed for high-visibility future leaders. Daniel's name was on the list. Mine wasn't. I stared at the screen longer than I expected to. Not because I felt jealous, but because I felt clarity. Perception had solidified. I wasn't being groomed for growth. I was being positioned for continuity. That's when I understood the role I had been assigned. Reliable, competent, low risk, replaceable. Not because my performance was lacking, but because I had made myself too adaptable. When you consistently absorb pressure, people forget what you cost. I began noticing subtler signals. Mark stopped asking for my opinion in one-on-ones about strategic direction. Instead, he asked about team morale, process efficiency, administrative timelines, important things, but not directional things. During a quarterly review, he said something that stayed with me. You're such a stabilizing force, Scarlett. You don't need the spotlight to make an impact. It was meant as praise, but praise can be containment in disguise. I walked back to my desk that afternoon and opened my black leather notebook. I wrote a single sentence across a blank page. If I don't define my role, someone else will. The truth was uncomfortable. I had participated in my own sidelining, not through incompetence, not through passivity, but through over-accommodation. I had believed that being indispensable operationally would translate into strategic security. But operational strength makes the transition easier. If systems run smoothly, leadership feels safe experimenting elsewhere, including your position. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Not yet, because I needed to answer one question honestly. Was I upset because I wanted recognition? Or was I concerned because something foundational was shifting? Those are two very different motivations. Recognition is ego. Foundation is survival, and survival requires calm assessment. A week later, that assessment would no longer be theoretical. It would be visible, transparent, separated from me by nothing more than a sheet of glass. The day it happened was ordinary. That's what I remember most. There was no dramatic email, no urgent calendar invite, no whispered warning from a sympathetic coworker. Just a Thursday afternoon. I was reviewing a vendor compliance report when I sensed movement in my peripheral vision. Our office was designed with glass-walled conference rooms lining the central corridor. Transparency was part of the brand, collaborative, open, modern. I looked up casually, and there he was, a man I had never seen before, sitting across from Mark and someone from HR in conference room B. My conference room, the room where I had interviewed years earlier, there's a strange instinct that activates in moments like that. Your mind searches for benign explanations. Client candidate, external consultant, audit representative. But then I saw the folder on the table, our company letterhead. The operations architecture summary was printed and clipped neatly together. My architecture, Mark leaned forward, speaking in that measured, evaluative tone I recognized instantly. The HR representative nodded, occasionally writing something down. The man across from them sat upright, attentive. Early 30s, maybe? Clean navy suit, intent expression. He wasn't relaxed like a client. He was performing. My replacement was sitting in the interview room while I was still employed. I didn't stand up. I didn't rush over. I didn't message anyone. I just watched. The glass between us felt symbolic. Close enough to see every gesture, far enough that I couldn't hear a word. And then it happened. Mark turned his laptop slightly, angling the screen toward the candidate. I recognized the slide deck layout immediately. It was my quarterly operational roadmap, rebranded without my name. They were recruiting my successor behind a glass wall I could see through. My pulse didn't spike. That surprised me. Instead, something settled, a quiet internal click. Like a lock turning, in that moment, everything aligned, the shifted permissions, the meeting exclusions, Daniel's expanded role, the leadership program invitation I never received. This wasn't evolution, it was transition planning, and I was the only person in the building who hadn't been informed. I lowered my gaze back to my screen, but I wasn't reading anymore. I was calculating. Anger would have been easy. Embarrassment would have been natural. But what I felt was clarity. If they were interviewing externally, it meant one of two things. Either I was about to be removed, or they believed I had nowhere else to go. Both assumptions were interesting. I closed the vendor report and opened my personal email in a separate browser tab. Not to apply anywhere. Not yet. Just to feel the shift. There's a specific kind of power that comes from seeing the full board, while others assume you're still focused on a single square. For years, I had absorbed operational risk for this company. I knew where contracts were fragile, which vendor agreements were undocumented, which processes relied solely on my undocumented decision trees. Not because I hoarded information, but because no one else had cared to understand the depth. I glanced up once more. The candidate smiled. Mark extended his hand. Interview over. I watched them walk him toward the exit, past my desk. Mark gave me a neutral nod as they passed. Neutral. As if nothing unusual had occurred. As if I hadn't just witnessed my own succession plan in motion. That was the moment something irreversible shifted, not externally, but internally. I stopped hoping the situation would correct itself, and I started planning. Silence was no longer patience. It was preparation. The morning after the interview, I arrived at the office 10 minutes earlier than usual. Not because I was anxious, because I was precise. There's a difference. I made coffee the same way. I greeted the receptionist the same way. I opened my laptop and reviewed overnight emails with the same neutral expression. No one watching me would have sensed a change. But silence, when it shifts from habit to strategy, feels different internally. The day unfolded predictably. Daniel mentioned he might be looped into more operational oversight soon. Mark scheduled a vague one-on-one with me for the following week. HR circulated a reminder about updated role documentation templates. All normal, all aligned. By lunchtime, I had made one quiet decision. I would not confront them. Confrontation would force acceleration. It would corner them into defensiveness. It would label me reactive. And reactive people lose leverage. Instead, I chose observation with intent. I began reviewing my own access. What systems were tied directly to my credentials? What vendor relationships relied on my personal rapport? What processes existed only in the margin notes of my black leather notebook? Not to sabotage, to understand value. There's a misconception about quiet people, that we are unaware, that we accept circumstances because we lack alternatives. But silence can be active. Silence can be reconnaissance. Over the next week, I changed nothing externally. I trained Daniel when he asked questions. I attended meetings I was invited to. I delivered reports ahead of schedule. If they were expecting signs of insecurity, they didn't receive them. What they didn't realize was that I had stopped volunteering context. When Daniel asked how I structured escalation matrices, I explained the visible steps, but not the judgment calls beneath them. When Mark referenced a process dependency, I answered the direct question, but didn't expand into adjacent risk areas. Not out of spite, out of bounds. For years, I had overextended clarity. I had filled gaps before anyone realized they existed. I had preempted problems that weren't yet visible. That week, I allowed visibility to emerge naturally. And something interesting happened. Small cracks appeared. A vendor response took longer because no one followed up with the nuance I normally applied. A cross-team approval stalled because the informal relationship I had cultivated wasn't activated. A metrics report contained an assumption that would have been corrected in my previous review cycle. No catastrophes, just friction. And friction reveals dependency. Mark stopped by my desk on Thursday afternoon. "Everything okay?" he asked casually. "Of course," I replied. "Weiss, just feels like there's more lag lately." I held his gaze calmly. Scaling transitions can create that. It was the most direct sentence I had spoken all week. He nodded slowly. Silence stretched between us, not hostile, but what's feasted. In that space, I realized something important. They believed I was static, predictable, safe. They had calculated my replacement without calculating my response. And my response wasn't emotional. It was a strategic restraint. I went home that night and updated my resume for the first time in 3 years. Not impulsively, accurately. For the first time, I described my role not as support, but as architect. Language matters, especially when you're preparing to move. Silence, at that point, was no longer something happening to me. It was something I was using, and they still hadn't noticed. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was my advantage. For 8 years, I had built systems that ran so smoothly, most people forgot they required architecture. Now I began mapping that architecture, not for them, but for myself. I started with documentation, not the sanitized process, guides stored on the shared drive. Those were surface level, clean, transferable. I opened my black leather notebook and began translating the real structure, the decision trees that never made it into official SOPs, the vendor personalities, the unwritten escalation thresholds, the political sensitivities between departments, the budget workarounds, the risk flags leadership preferred not to see in writing. I wasn't hoarding, I was auditing. There's a quiet power in understanding where knowledge lives and where it doesn't. Over the next few weeks, I paid close attention to Daniel's integration. He was smart, ambitious, eager to prove himself, but he operated from theory, not lived in friction. He trusted the org chart. I trusted the undercurrents. When he shadowed vendor negotiations, I noticed he relied heavily on formal contract language. He hadn't yet learned which clauses were symbolic and which were leverage. He didn't know which vendor CFO preferred direct calls over email. He hadn't seen how quickly timelines collapsed when one specific regional office delayed sign-off. Those aren't things you teach in a single training session. They're absorbed over years of quiet correction. I also began reviewing my employment agreement. Not emotionally, legally. Non-compete clauses, notice periods, intellectual property boundaries. I consulted a former colleague, now a compliance attorney, under the guise of general career curiosity. I didn't mention the interview. I didn't need to. She reviewed my contract and said something simple. You have more optionality than you think. Optionality. That word stayed with me. Back at the office, bits of subtle signs and continued. The external candidate I had seen through the glass returned for a second meeting. This time they used conference room A, angled slightly away from my desk. Interesting adjustment. Still visible. Still transparent. No one addressed it with me. Meanwhile, small operational strain continued surfacing. Nothing catastrophic, just inefficiencies that required intervention. And each time I waited a little longer before stepping in. Not long enough to damage outcomes, just long enough for others to feel the weight of resolution. Dependency is invisible until it's interrupted. One afternoon, Daniel approached me with a more complex issue. A cross-border compliance escalation that involved 3 vendors and 2 legal teams. I've been trying to map this, he admitted, but I feel like I'm missing context. You are, I thought. Instead, I said, walk me through your assumptions. He explained his logic clearly, structured, clean, incomplete. I corrected only what was necessary to prevent exposure. I didn't volunteer the relational shortcuts. I didn't explain the historical landmines. Not because I wanted him to fail, because I needed leadership to experience the difference between oversight and ownership. At night, I built something else quietly. Relationships. I reconnected with 2 former clients who had since moved to other firms. I updated my LinkedIn, not loudly, just accurately. I responded to a recruiter message I would have ignored months earlier. I didn't announce dissatisfaction. I signaled capability. The most powerful shifts rarely involve confrontation. They involve repositioning before anyone realizes the board has changed. By the end of the month, I had 3 exploratory conversations scheduled. Nothing guaranteed, nothing reckless, just alignment. And something else happened internally. The sting of the glass wall faded. In its place came detachment. When you see clearly that you are being transitioned out, you stop trying to earn permanence. You start calculating the trajectory. They believed I was reacting slowly. In reality, I was moving deliberately. And the most significant preparation of all? I stopped tying my identity to the company's perception of me. Once that separation occurs, fear loses its leverage. What they never noticed was that I wasn't defending my role anymore. I was redefining my exit, quietly, systematically, without urgency. Because the most effective reversals aren't explosive. They're inevitable. The leverage didn't arrive like a revelation. It unfolded like confirmation. About 6 weeks after I first saw the interview through the glass wall, Mark scheduled the one-on-one he had postponed twice. The calendar invite was neutral. Role alignment discussion. Language matters. When someone avoids the word change, they're already managing optics. I entered his office with my notebook, calm as always. He closed the door gently. Another small signal. Privacy without urgency. Scarlett, he began, folding his hands together. We're evaluating how operations leadership scales over the next year. Scales, future-oriented language, distancing from the present. He spoke carefully about evolving structures, expanding oversight, and the need for dynamic visibility in client-facing strategy. He praised my stability again, my reliability, my foundational presence. Then he paused. We may be bringing in additional senior leadership to complement your strengths. Complement. I held his gaze evenly. Define complement, I said quietly. He hesitated. Not long, but long. More external-facing strategic positioning, freeing you to focus on operational excellence. There it was. They weren't eliminating my position. They were reframing it downward. I nodded once. Understood. No accusation, no visible reaction. Inside, however, something aligned fully for the first time. The external candidate wasn't a peer. He was my replacement in authority, while I would remain as infrastructure. A silent demotion masked as optimization. And here's what Mark didn't know. 3 days earlier, I had received a formal exploratory offer from one of the firms I'd quietly reconnected with. Not a final contract, but serious. Director level, full strategic oversight, higher compensation, explicit authorship over operational architecture. They had used one word repeatedly in our conversations. Ownership. Sitting across from Mark, I felt something unexpected. Relief, not because they were replacing me, but because they had clarified their perception permanently. Ambiguity is stressful. Clarity is freeing. I appreciate the transparency, I told him. If structural changes are coming, I'd like formal documentation of revised responsibilities. Professional, measured. His eyebrows lifted slightly. He hadn't expected documentation requests. Of course, he replied. That was the private reveal. Not to him. Not to him, but to myself. I had leverage in 3 dimensions: institutional dependency, external opportunity, contractual optionality, and most importantly, emotional detachment. I returned to my desk and opened my email. The exploratory offer sat there, waiting for my response, timeline confirmation. I didn't reply immediately. I took a breath. The power in that moment wasn't about leaving impulsively. It wasn't about threatening resignation. It wasn't about confrontation. It was about knowing that I no longer needed validation from the room with the glass walls. For years, I had measured my value against internal perception. Now I had external confirmation of it. And when those 2 perceptions diverge, you have information. The next week, HR circulated a draft of the revised operations leadership structure. My responsibilities were listed clearly. Execution-focused, internal oversight, reduced strategic authority. Daniel's name appeared beneath a new title: Associate Director, Strategic Operations. Associate, for now. I read the document slowly, then I closed it. No one came to check on my reaction. They assumed my silence meant acceptance. What they didn't understand was this: silence can also mean a decision already made. That was the private reveal. I wasn't being replaced because I lacked capability. I was being repositioned because I had allowed them to believe I would stay regardless. They were calculating based on loyalty. I was recalculating based on the trajectory. And trajectories, once shifted, don't announce themselves. They simply move, quietly, irreversibly. There's a specific weight to irreversible decisions. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels still. The exploratory offer became formal 2 weeks later. A written contract. Director of Operational Strategy. Full authorship over systems architecture. A compensation increase, significant enough to be symbolic, not just financial, but positional. They weren't offering me stability. They were offering me authority. I printed the document and placed it inside my black leather notebook. I didn't sign it immediately, because leaving isn't just about opportunity. It's about timing. At my current firm, the restructuring announcement was scheduled for the next quarterly town hall, 3 weeks away. The new external hire would be introduced then. I knew this because Daniel mentioned casually that leadership transitions are coming soon. Transitions, plural. That told me something important. They planned to present the shift as an expansion, not a replacement. If I resigned before the announcement, they would control the narrative completely. It would look like a coincidence. Or worse, instability on my part. If I waited until after, I would be resigning from a visibly diminished role. Neither option was emotional. Both were strategic. So I did what I've always done best. I evaluated the board. Option 1. Confront Mark directly. Leverage the external offer to negotiate authority retention. Risk. They would accelerate the transition, question my loyalty, and possibly begin documentation to manage me out on their timeline. Option 2. Stay. Accept the reframed role. Outperform quietly and rebuild influence. Risk. Authority once publicly reduced is rarely restored without visible conflict. Option 3. Sign the offer. Give measured notice. Exit before the glass wall becomes opaque. Risk. Letting go of institutional legacy. That last risk was the only one that lingered. 8 years is not insignificant. I had built systems that would outlast me. I had mentored people who trusted me. Leaving meant surrendering control over how those systems evolved, but staying meant endorsing a perception that no longer aligned with reality. The decision crystallized one evening at home. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the offer letter in front of me. The city lights outside my window reflected faintly against the glass, another transparent barrier. I asked myself one question. If I stay, what am I teaching them about my value? Silence is powerful, but so is departure. Not as punishment, as clarity. The next morning, I signed the contract. Not impulsively, deliberately. I emailed the new firm to confirm my start date, 4 weeks out. Then I drafted my resignation letter. 2 paragraphs, professional, concise, no accusations, no explanations beyond pursuing a leadership opportunity aligned with long-term strategic goals. I did not mention the interview room. I did not mention the restructuring draft, because this wasn't about exposing them. It was about aligning myself. I scheduled a meeting with Mark for the following Monday. And for the first time since I saw my replacement through the glass, I felt something close to anticipation. Not because I was about to confront him, but because I had already moved, irreversibly. He just didn't know it yet. I didn't hand in my resignation immediately. Even after signing the new contract, I waited 3 days, not out of hesitation, out of sequencing. There were a few final details to secure: background verification confirmation, onboarding documentation, and legal review of intellectual property boundaries. I wanted no ambiguity, no gaps, no emotional leakage into logistics. When everything aligned, I walked into Mark's office on Monday morning with my notebook in hand. He looked up, neutral expression. "Morning, Scarlett. Do you have a few minutes?" I asked. He gestured toward the chair. I placed the single-page resignation letter on his desk and slid it forward gently. "I've accepted a director-level position elsewhere," I said calmly. "My notice period begins today." Silence. Not explosive, not dramatic, just recalculation. He read the letter once, then again. "This is unexpected," he said carefully. I imagine it is. His eyes searched my face for agitation, for frustration, for a clue. He found none. "Can I ask why?" He continued. "You're restructuring operations leadership," I replied evenly. "I'm aligning my trajectory accordingly." I didn't accuse him of replacing me. I didn't reference the interview room. I didn't need to. The implications settled between us. He leaned back slowly. "We were planning to expand the team, not diminish you." "I understand," I said, "and I appreciate the experience I've gained here." Experience. Past tense. That was when I saw it. The subtle shift in his posture. The realization that the timeline had reversed, that he no longer controlled the narrative sequence. They had planned to announce leadership changes with confidence, introduce the new hire, reframe my role, manage perception. Now my resignation would precede their reveal, which meant questions. He asked about counteroffers, compensation adjustments, strategic reconsiderations. I declined each calmly. "I've already signed," I said, "and I'm confident in the move." Confidence ends negotiations quickly. Over the next 2 weeks, something fascinating unfolded. Suddenly, my calendar filled again. Meetings I had been excluded from reappeared. Leadership asked for my insight on pending initiatives. Daniel scheduled extended knowledge transfer sessions. Knowledge transfer. An interesting phrase when you realize how much of it isn't transferable. I fulfilled my notice professionally. I documented processes thoroughly, but not intimately. I provided structure without exposing judgment frameworks. I ensured no operational collapse would occur. But I did not rebuild what they had already chosen to shift away from me. HR scheduled an exit interview. "Was there anything we could have done to retain you?" the representative asked. I paused. "You could have involved me in the strategic conversation sooner," I said calmly. "Perception shapes loyalty." She wrote that down. Whether it would change anything, I didn't know. The external hire, my almost successor, never officially joined. I found that out quietly during my final week. The offer had been delayed. Budget realignment, strategic reconsideration. Interesting timing. Daniel's role remained elevated, but undefined. Mark's tone around me shifted from managerial to cautious. For the first time in 8 years, I felt something new in that building. Leverage. Not because I threatened, because I left. On my final afternoon, I packed my desk slowly. My black leather notebook slid into my bag last. As I walked past the glass conference rooms one final time, I glanced inside conference room B. Empty. Transparent. Still, there's a difference between being replaced and choosing to move. One feels like erasure, the other feels like authorship. I stepped through the exit doors without ceremony. No applause, no confrontation, just a quiet departure. And behind me, the consequences had already begun unfolding. They just didn't fully understand them yet. My first week at the new firm was quiet in a different way. Not cautious, not political, intentional. They didn't ask me to support, they asked me to design. The contrast was immediate. In my second meeting, the CEO turned to me and said, "You'll own the operational roadmap. What do you need to make it scalable? Own. There's something almost disorienting about being treated in alignment with your actual capability after years of subtle minimization. But while I was onboarding into authorship, the ripple effects of my departure began surfacing at my former company. Not through gossip, through silence. A former colleague texted me 3 days after my exit. Did you keep a master escalation tracker offline? I smiled faintly. No, I replied truthfully. Everything documented is in the shared system. What wasn't documented were the contextual adjustments, the judgment calls, the historical nuance behind certain vendor concessions. The system existed. The interpretation didn't. By the end of my second week, another message arrived, this time from Daniel. Quick question. How did you usually handle Region 4 compliance exceptions when legal stalled? Usually. Past tense, I answered concisely. Enough to prevent failure, not enough to replace experience. I wasn't withholding. I was no longer responsible. Internally, from what I gathered, friction increased. A proposal was delayed because a vendor relationship cooled. A cross-department initiative stalled because informal alliances I had nurtured were never formalized. Leadership discovered that operational stability requires more than updated org charts. Dependency had been mistaken for simplicity. Mark emailed me once, formally, requesting clarification on a budgetary forecasting model. I assumed Daniel had full visibility into your methodology, he wrote. Assumed. I responded professionally with surface documentation. No resentment, just boundaries. The external hire they had interviewed never materialized. Budget constraints, I later learned, made the new salary band difficult to justify. So they elevated internally instead, which meant Daniel now held the strategic visibility they had prepared for someone else, without the years of insulation beneath it. None of this was catastrophic. The company didn't collapse, but performance dipped. Client satisfaction scores flattened. Internal turnover increased slightly. Nothing dramatic enough to alarm investors, but noticeable to those who understood baseline stability. And here's the quiet truth. They didn't miss me as a person. They missed the friction I used to absorb. There's a difference. When someone leaves and chaos erupts, it's obvious. When someone leaves and subtle inefficiencies accumulate, it's harder to trace. That's what happened. At my new firm, meanwhile, I was implementing frameworks with full authorship. I named the architecture. I presented the strategy directly to clients. When I spoke, no one rebranded my ideas. Authority felt lighter than I expected, because I no longer had to defend it. About a month after I left, I heard through a former colleague that leadership had delayed announcing the restructuring. They reframed it again, less emphasis on expansion, more on evolving team synergy, language adjusting to circumstances. I wasn't vindicated. I wasn't triumphant. I was validated, not because they struggled, but because the narrative they had constructed, of me as foundational but non-strategic, couldn't sustain itself without my foundation. Consequences rarely arrive as explosions. They arrive as gradual realizations. And realization, once it settles in a room, is difficult to reverse. They had planned for my continuity. They hadn't planned for my departure. And now, the cost of that miscalculation was becoming visible. Quietly, just like everything else. About 6 weeks after I left, Mark called. Not emailed, called. I let it ring once before answering, not as a tactic, just as timing. Scarlett, he began, his voice measured but tighter than I remembered. I hope the new role is going well. It is, I replied thank you. There was a pause. I'll be direct, he said. We underestimated how much operational architecture lived with you. Underestimated, not unappreciated. Underestimated. I documented everything within scope, I said calmly. Yes, he exhaled. You did, but there are gaps. Gaps. I knew what he meant. Not missing files, missing fluency. He explained that a major client had escalated concerns about inconsistent communication. Vendor negotiations were taking longer. Internal approvals were bottlenecking because no one felt confident overriding minor risk flags without precedent. They had structure. They lacked instinct. We're considering bringing in a consultant to stabilize things temporarily, he added. The irony was almost elegant. They had tried to recruit my successor behind a glass wall I could see through. Now they were considering paying externally for stability I had provided internally. What would you need from me? I asked. Another pause. Would you be open to advising during transition? Contractually. There it was. Not reinstatement. Not an apology. Transaction. I didn't feel anger. I felt distance. I'm fully committed to my current firm, I said carefully. My bandwidth is limited. That's understandable, he replied quickly. We'd compensate appropriately. Compensation wasn't the issue. The issue was timing. If they had involved me transparently in strategic conversations, if they had framed expansion as collaboration, rather than quiet displacement, the trajectory might have been different. But leadership decisions reveal priorities, and priorities, once exposed, reshape loyalty permanently. I can provide a written clarification on specific process questions, I offered. Beyond that, I'm not in a position to consult. Professional, firm, final. He accepted it with restrained disappointment. After the call ended, I sat still for a moment, not triumphant, not vindicated, just aware. Too late to fix it doesn't always mean collapse. Sometimes it means recalibration at a higher cost. They would recover. Companies adapt, new leaders grow into roles, consultants smooth edges. But what couldn't be repaired was trust. Not mine, theirs. Because once leadership realizes they miscalculated someone's value, it changes how they assess everyone else. And once an employee realizes they were repositioned without conversation, it changes how they assess loyalty. Weeks later, I heard that the restructuring announcement was finally made. Scaled down, language softened. Daniel remained in his role, but under closer oversight. Budget constraints prevented additional hires. The glass walls remained transparent, symbolic. At my new firm, I led my first full strategic review presentation. Afterward, a junior analyst approached me. "I've never seen operations framed like that," she said. "You make it look deliberate." Deliberate. That word felt accurate. What happened at my former company wasn't sabotage. It wasn't revenge. It was a sequence. They made a calculation based on perception. I made one based on clarity. And once clarity enters the equation, reversal becomes difficult. Not because someone loses, but because alignment changes. And alignment, once shifted, doesn't slide back easily. Too late doesn't mean dramatic. It means irreversible. I saw Mark one last time in person. 3 months after I left, we both attended the same regional operations summit. Different companies, same industry. Glass-walled convention center overlooking the river. Fitting. I noticed him before he noticed me. He looked slightly more tired than I remembered. Not dramatically, just the subtle fatigue of recalibration. When our eyes met, he hesitated for half a second. Then he approached. "Scarlett," he said, offering a small smile. "You look well." "I am," I replied. We stepped slightly away from the main corridor into a quieter section near the windows. The city stretched behind the glass, transparent, distant. "I've been meaning to say," he began, "we mishandled your transition. Not defensive, not evasive, just measured." I waited. "We should have involved you earlier. I thought protecting you from uncertainty was considerate." He exhaled softly. "It wasn't. Protecting." That word almost made me smile. "I don't think it was about protection," I said calmly. "I think it was about assumption." He didn't argue. "You assumed I would stay regardless," I continued. "Because I always had. The air between us wasn't tense. It was honest." He nodded slowly. "That's fair." There was no apology wrapped in theatrics, no attempt to rewrite history. Just acknowledgement. "I hope you know it wasn't about capability," he added. "You were foundational." Foundational. Again. "Foundation doesn't need to be quiet," I replied gently. "It just needs to be recognized." He looked at me for a moment longer than usual, assessing, perhaps recalibrating his understanding of who I had always been. "We felt it when you left," he admitted. "More than we expected." "I know," I said. Not arrogantly, just factually. A silence settled. Not awkward, not heavy, just complete. I was disconcerted. "I'm glad you landed somewhere that sees you clearly," he said finally. "So am I." There was no dramatic closure, no emotional crescendo, just two professionals standing at the edge of a decision that had already reshaped both trajectories. As we parted, he added, almost as an afterthought, "You taught me something about quiet leadership." I paused. "What's that?" "That it's only quiet because others aren't listening closely enough." That was the closest thing to an apology I needed, because confrontation without heat doesn't aim to wound. It aims to clarify. I walked back into the summit hall feeling something unexpected. Not superiority, not resentment. Completion. There's power in leaving without burning bridges. There's power in allowing others to arrive at realization on their own timeline. And there's a specific kind of dominance that never raises its voice. It simply moves. The glass walls in that building reflected the afternoon light, just as they had months earlier in my old office. Transparent. But this time I wasn't watching from outside. I was exactly where I had chosen to stand. If you had asked me a year ago to describe myself, I would have said reliable, operational, supportive. Now, I would say architect, strategist, deliberate. The difference isn't skill, it's ownership. At my new firm, I don't sit slightly back from the table anymore. Not because I'm louder, but because my seat was defined correctly from the beginning. When I speak, people attribute the ideas accurately. When I design systems, my name is attached to the architecture. Not for ego, for clarity. I've learned something subtle but irreversible. If you allow others to frame your value, they will frame it within their convenience. That doesn't make them villains. It makes them human. Organizations optimize for stability. Leaders optimize for perceived risk. And people like me, calm, steady, adaptable, often get categorized as permanent infrastructure rather than directional force. The mistake I made wasn't silence. It was assumed that silence would be interpreted correctly. Now my quiet isn't an accommodation. It's calibration. When I enter a new environment, I define the scope early. I ask direct questions about authority. I clarify what ownership means in measurable terms. I don't wait for recognition to validate responsibility. And interestingly, when boundaries are defined early, respect follows more naturally. I mentor differently now too. When I see someone competent but understated, I don't just praise their reliability. I ask them about ambition. I encourage them to articulate their vision publicly. I remind them that being indispensable operationally does not automatically translate to strategic security. Because it doesn't. I still carry my black leather notebook, but its pages look different. Less defensive documentation, more proactive design. I don't track exclusion anymore. I map expansion. Sometimes late at night, I think about the glass wall, about the man in the navy suit, about the version of me who sat at her desk and chose not to panic. I'm proud of her, not because she endured, because she recalibrated. There's a quiet dignity in recognizing when you are being repositioned and choosing to reposition yourself more effectively. No humiliation required, no raised voices, just clarity. I no longer measure my value by how much friction I can absorb without complaint. I measure it by how intentionally I shape direction. And perhaps the most important shift of all, I don't need anyone to underestimate me anymore, because I don't underestimate myself. The woman who once watched her replacement through a glass wall now designs rooms where transparency isn't a threat, it's a principle. And that difference? It's permanent. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it isn't about corporate politics. It's about perception. My replacement was sitting in the interview room while I was still employed. They were recruiting my successor behind a glass wall I could see through. And yet, that moment didn't destroy me. It clarified me. For a long time, I believed that quiet competence would protect me. If I absorbed enough pressure, fixed enough problems, and stayed emotionally composed, leadership would naturally see my full value. But organizations don't interpret silence the way we intend it. They interpret what's visible. If you don't define your trajectory, someone else will define it based on convenience. That doesn't mean you need to become louder. It doesn't mean you need to fight publicly. It doesn't mean you need revenge. It means you need alignment. When I saw the interview through the glass, I had two choices: react emotionally or respond strategically. I chose a strategy, not to hurt anyone, not to win, but to move into a space where my authority matched my capability. And here's the quiet truth. The most powerful form of dominance isn't confrontation. It's departure with clarity. No scandal, no shouting, no dramatic exits. Just a decision made so calmly that others only understand its impact after you're gone. If you're in a season where meetings are shifting without you, where your ideas are being echoed louder by someone else, where you feel repositioned but no one has said it out loud yet, pause, observe, document, and ask yourself one honest question. Are you staying because you're valued or because they assume you will? I'd genuinely like to know. Have you ever realized you were being quietly replaced? And what did you do next?